Hello. So today, I'll be discussing the Wounded Knee documentary, and talk about pretty much the occupation of the Lakota Sioux on the Wounded Knee reservation. So pretty much we'll answer the first question and talk about the varieties of protests that were used, and how successful they were. Pretty much, the Lakota Sioux used a mix of like militant and I guess you would have to kind of say it was violent. But it was provoked violence, I'd feel like, more self-defense, if anything, than violence. But they were pushed to this point due to reasons, pretty much unfair treatment of a very bad leader on the reservation. And so they decided to take an uprising of Wounded Knee until demands were met, and they were given better treatment on their reservation. So for 71 days, the Native American protesters held off the federal government at gunpoint. They went in and they looted a store in a village and took a nearby church, quote unquote, took some hostages, blocked off all entrances to Wounded Knee, and actually fired the first shot at feds when they first pulled up to Wounded Knee. Basically, their basic demands were just calling for a federal investigation for the corruption on Indian reservations, and also called for immediate hearings on the broken treaties with Indian nations, trying to get some of that land back. What they really wanted was for Dick Wilson, that very bad leader I was talking about, to be fired because he was just spreading the money where he wanted it to be spread, mistreating certain groups of Indians, more so the native tongue speaking Indians, and had them beat up and just messed up stuff. There was another group, more militant style group, that joined the group at Wounded Knee, the Oglala at Wounded Knee, and they were called AIM. And the documentary kind of foreshadowed another protest that they did that was also low-key violent, and it was basically at a courthouse in Custer over a white man that was charged with manslaughter instead of first-degree murder after killing an Indian. So a fight kind of ensued at the courthouse, and then they threw Molotov inside of there and basically set the courthouse into flames. As the U.S. military came in and started kind of posting up and almost trying to intimidate the Native American Indians, one of their first signs of success was basically they went in and tried to talk to some of the hostages, but the hostages said they didn't want to be released and that they weren't hostages at all. And that it was the American government's fault that the Indians were even there and that they were so upset. And it kind of shows the first signs that the Indians were starting to win over the hearts of the American public, which was very important if they wanted to stay on that reservation for a long time, and also if they wanted their demands. A series of back and forth. Finally, on day 38, they promised to investigate corruption on Pine Ridge and immediately convene a meeting on treaty rights. In exchange, the Indians would lay down their arms. But this plan kind of fell through because the U.S. government was like, well, you lay down your arms first and then we'll have this negotiation. And the Indians were like, well, we'll have this negotiation and then we'll lay down our arms. We're not going to get fooled again. And that basically led to nothing. But I mean, it was low-key a victory, successful victory, but in the end, it really wasn't because it didn't result. On day 72, it ended, and it was unsuccessful in getting of any of what they asked for. There were multiple Indian casualties and deaths. And so, although it didn't have any success on paper, it did kick down the door for the American public to show who the Native Americans really were, because they were kind of casted in the shadows, and the injustices that they faced. It also allowed for the entry of Native Americans into politics. We started getting some prominent political figures that were Native Americans, and also just this enormous wave of Native American pride through reconnecting with Indian culture. So they started getting back into their roots, speaking their language, and just teaching Indians that it's okay to be Indian. Later on down the line, though, at the end of the documentary, it did say that in 1980, the government ruled that they did steal land, indeed, and offered $105 million in reparations to the Native Americans, but they refused it because they wanted the land more so than the money. And now it said that the number stands at $830 million. So I'm not too sure if they took it or not. but does seem like somewhat of a victory. To the role the media played in this event and how effective media basically allowed for day-to-day coverage of the event, shining a spotlight on the injustices of the Native Americans who had been long shunned away and forgotten about. It also brought other injustices to light that weren't really connected to what they were doing at Wounded Knee, but that had previously happened, like just pretty much the kidnapping of just hundreds and thousands of Native American kids being sent to boarding schools. That was one of the injustices that were low-key brought to light because of this rally at Wounded Knee. Like I said, since the media was this spotlight that shined Wounded Knee to the world, it was able to attract more and more Indians, not even Lakota Sioux Indians, but all types of Indians to come and support. Some media outlets tried to paint the Indians in a bad light, and some media outlets didn't. But the Native Americans more so felt like that public coverage was public coverage, whether it was good or bad. They just wanted to get their names and faces out there to say, hey, this is us. These are our problems. This is what's going on. We need help. Another big thing was that the media provided the Indians protection, as the camp could have easily been taken over way before 72 days. And due to Wounded Knee's ugly history, the last thing that the government wanted was another Indian massacre, this time with the American public watching instead of just hearing about it. They would be able to see it live, and so it would cut deeper, and this gave the Indians pretty much a bubble to be in. Once they started wiping media outlets off the reservation and telling them to go home, it was pretty much too late. And we saw this through acts of Marlon Brando declining his Oscar, and then he sent an Apache actress instead. And then shortly after that, a poll was taken all across America, and it was shown that the majority was in favor of the American people. Of the American Indian people. The media, just like almost every civil rights movement, was very effective in the role it played, because it just needed to get the message out there, and then it needed to kind of show or disband any kind of misconceptions about that group, so that the Indian people aren't just some kind of savages, but they are intellectual people with thoughts and feelings and demands. My takeaway from the evolution of protests for civil rights, it has changed and it has stayed the same. So that the way that the protesters are handled has not changed from today, and even back then with the Lakota, protesters are still being met with military force. And it's basically a way of trying to make them seem like they are more of a distraction disruption versus people that just want what's best for them. AIM and the younger generation of Indian protesters are more like today's protesters than the African American civil rights protesters of the 1960s, because of their more militant style of protesting and seizing national monuments, and vandalizing the HQ of Indian Affairs. That gives you more of the image of what's going on today. You know, people going in and looting and rioting and burning things up. And even though they might not actually be part of the protest, it kind of just gives that feeling of we're fed up, we're done, this is the last straw, this is the last stand. And nonviolence hasn't gotten us anywhere. So this is what we have to do. Pretty much the way that these protests have kind of changed is their reliance on the media has decreased over the years, because we now have things like social media. And through social media, we can, get people to say, hey, come out, help us. Or we can get people to say, hey, this is what's going on. This is our problem. These are our demands. Instead of relying on the media to come out and kind of cover that for us as protesters. What I thought was different between this Wounded Knee protest and other civil rights protests is that even though they were protesting for civil rights, it was mainly or more so centered around their cultural freedom. Their right to get to speak their own native tongue and to, practice their native dances and pray to their gods, things of that nature. You get what I'm saying? And that had kind of been stripped away from them over the years, unlike a lot of other groups that were fighting for civil rights. This is pretty much all I have. I've enjoyed my semester, learned a lot. And I want to thank you for taking the time to watch these videos. Appreciate it.